All right, we are recording now. Thank you all for attending this ACRL Oregon webinar. I'm Rachel Bridgewater, a reference librarian at Portland Community College and a member of the ACRL Oregon board. Right now, your microphone should be muted. If you haven't already done so, please also turn your video off. The speakers will be taking questions after they're done presenting. And you can either unmute your microphone at that time or use the chat on the right-hand side, and I'll be monitoring that. You can also feel free to use the chat to ask questions as they come up, and I'll collect them and share them with the speakers during the Q&A. After this session, when the recording is ready, you'll get an email with a link to the recorded session and a session evaluation. We'd really appreciate it if you'd fill out the evaluation so we can continue to improve our offerings. So today's webinar is entitled Anti-Racism and EDI Work, Where Are Oregon Academic Libraries? And our presenters are the OLA, EDI, and Anti-Racism Committee Co-Chair, Alma Plasencia, and EDI and Anti-Racism Committee members, Melissa Anderson and Emily Ford. And just thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us, and we look forward to learning from you.
Thank you. So hi everyone, I'm Alma Plasencia. I am a librarian with the Salem Public Library, and I am also the co-chair of the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Anti-Racism Special Committee with OLA. What I will be doing is providing a brief overview of the survey, basically its purpose and how it was started. Like I said, so the reason behind the survey, also who responded, and then later on in this webinar, we will be talking about the results and what they mean for academic Oregon libraries. So first, why the survey? So our committee had a pretty huge challenge, which was how do we advise Oregon libraries on EDI and anti-racism best practices? So we had some unknowns here. Where on the spectrum were Oregon libraries in terms of their EDI and anti-racism work? So that led to the question, what areas of EDI and anti-racism are libraries excelling in, and what areas do libraries need supported? So this is primarily the question that informed our survey. In terms of how we marketed the survey, we actually published it in the OLA EDI Anti-Racism Toolkit, and we also introduced a survey at the Public Library Division Directors and Leadership Training back in January, where we had asked directors and various leadership staff of libraries to promote the survey amongst their staff and also to take it as well. We also marketed the survey via the various listservs that you see on your screen. And we had the survey open for about 4 weeks. In terms of its development, all the questions were vetted through the EDI and Anti-Racism Committee. They were also vetted through the Oregon Library Association Board. And the chair, Marcy Ramiro Jenkins, and I consulted with the State Library of Oregon to make sure that we wrote the questions in a way that would not pinpoint to any particular library, but also just to keep it anonymous. The State Library of Oregon also hosted the survey on their SurveyMonkey account. And let's see. In terms of who responded, we had a total of 382 responses. 94 of those responses came from folks that work at academic libraries. In terms of race and ethnicity, the majority of folks identified as white at a little over 76%. In total, for the 382 responses, most worked in public libraries at a little over 64%. The second largest group working in academic libraries at a little over 24%, followed by school libraries and special government and vendor libraries. In terms of library settings, the majority of academic librarians reported, or academic staff reported, working in urban libraries, followed by suburban and rural library settings. In terms of library size, most worked in mid-sized libraries or between 11 and 30 staff members. And in terms of what our respondents do, a little over 40% said that they worked as librarians, with a little, and then followed by library staff at a little over 32%. And then finally, we're just going to go ahead and go over the survey results, starting with Emily Ford. I'm going to go ahead and start this.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm having mouse problems. Couldn't unmute myself. So I'm Emily. It's nice to see you all. Lots of familiar names in the participants list. I'm on this committee, and I'm also on the ACRL Oregon board. Oh, it says, okay, well, okay. Yeah, I wanted to also, Rachel, can you put this link in the chat now? This is the link to the results that are filtered by academic libraries. So you can see like all of the demographics and everything. And actually question 6, Melissa, did you want to take it? Because I think that was.
Yeah, I can take question 6. So I am Melissa Anderson. I am the Campus Engagement Research Services Librarian at Southern Oregon University in Ashland, Oregon. So it is nice to see all of your names. Some of you I know from other things, and it's great that you made time for us today. The first question I was going to talk about was, is my library increasing diversity through job postings and hiring practices to bring library staffing in line with community demographics? And so, as you can see from the slide here, or the survey here, most people responded that this work was ongoing. There were a few people, it looks like about 10%, who responded that it was yes, and this work, or that this work was completed, and then some said no, not yet, and some said they don't know. And one thing that the committee kind of struggled with a lot was, what do these ongoing responses actually mean? In some cases, does this mean this work is we're interested in doing this work, but we haven't actually done it yet? Or does it mean we're in the process of doing this? Ongoing may just mean that the library is trying to develop develop practices that will encourage more diverse candidates to apply and hire more diverse candidates. But it also might mean that they haven't been successful in doing that yet. We hoped that completed or yes meant that they actually have been successful in hiring diverse candidates, and not just that they hired a diverse person and now they're done with that. That would not be ideal. There are a lot of different ways that libraries can work towards diversity in hiring. Certainly, advertising is a starting point, although it's not enough. My own library has done a lot of hiring recently, and we found that there's a diversity upgrade for ALA job list postings that especially target interest groups and things like that. Reaching out personally to people in interest groups and committees working on EDI issues for cross-posting job openings can also help. There's a lot more that needs to be done besides just advertising, though. Sometimes some things in job descriptions might need to be reworded to make sure it's clear that diverse candidates are encouraged to apply. There's also a problem with gatekeeping in certain job descriptions. And so reviewing minimum and preferred qualifications can help make sure that's not happening. And then, of course, the very best thing to do is to actively recruit people of color for positions. That's complicated in an academic library where there may be processes in place, HR policies that have to be followed pretty strictly, but certainly, encouraging people to apply for jobs and reaching out to people of color is extremely important, and something that is probably evidence is not being done enough by the fact that so many of the people who replied to the survey do identify as white. There are trainings available on the EDI anti-racism section of the OLA website that are about hiring and about hiring practices that do encourage diversity in hiring.
Okay, question 7. Is my library supporting staff from underrepresented groups? And I think the few thoughts that I have about this is in the no, not yet category. it's possible that perhaps the library doesn't have a diverse staff at all, or people representative of oppressed or marginalized groups. So that's something to consider. That I don't know, I see as a problematic response because maybe people don't know what's happening in their libraries. That could be an administrative issue, that maybe administration isn't doing a good job of communicating, or maybe the person is so overworked and just hasn't engaged in these issues at all, which is also possible. I'd like to think that anyone taking the survey, however, at least has opted in to participate just by offering their feedback, though. So just a lot of things that we don't know. Ongoing is quite encouraging. I'd like to see personally that number much higher. And then this is where yes completed could be a little complicated, because yes maybe could also mean ongoing. It could rather than like, yeah, done. Because the yes completed is just not a response that we want to see for this particular question, since supporting staff is not a one and done kind of task. I think Melissa, you're up for number 8.
Yes. Number 8 is my library developing anti-racist policies? And this is another one where ongoing is probably desirable, because as situations evolve, new policies always need to be developed. I don't know if it's possible to, have a policy and just be done with it. But you also don't want to leave things at a situation like we're working on it, right? So ongoing is possibly problematic if it's like we're working on it, but we haven't actually gotten anywhere yet. We're talking about policies, but we haven't actually done any policies yet. Certainly having SMART goals with identifiable end products and deadlines might help to actually create some policies and implement them. It's the no area that worried me the most on this, because it's fairly large actually. And for this one, it's about almost 25% of the respondents said they were not working on anti-racist policies. And those are the libraries that probably want to look at the toolkit. Maybe they need a special committee within their library to be put together, or even different committees from different work areas that might need to review policies that may need to be revised. And policies are good things to have, but there also needs to be buy-in at every level to make sure that policies are followed. So that, that would call for staff development and trainings on buy-in and policy creation are things that are available on the OLA website, also in the section on anti-racism and EDI work.
Okay, question 9, and some of this is kind of reflected in what Melissa was just talking about as well. They're obviously related. Written statements, these are they can be so problematic, right? Because a written statement could just be a performance. And, without action and without change or without thinking, and they're meaningless in my IMHO, in my very humble opinion. So that's why I wonder if, and maybe this is Pollyanna of me, that the answer no or not yet is that statements haven't been developed because organizations don't want it to be a performative statement. Maybe they want it to be something that's actionable, or so, we can't really know from, quantitative data like this. It's so hard to know what's happening. I think it can be like we've peeled back a layer and then there's more to investigate. Ongoing is encouraging as well, and the same issue exists here with the yes and completed. Yes could mean ongoing, completed. I'd like to view these statements as, again, not one and done. I see these statements as living documents as we all continue to learn, and from current events. I don't know, again, I think might point to a communication issue between perhaps higher up and the folks on the ground doing work. that again, oh, I just had a thought, it went out of my brain, I'm sorry. But then there's the issue of, you know, are these statements top down, or are they being developed by a group, a mixed group of people with different positions, different work areas, like Melissa was talking about? So there's just a lot of more questions that I think this data points to. So I'm ready for number 10, please. And this, I'm encouraged by the ongoing equity evaluations and the yes completed also. Can we fold that in? And then, you know, when is it, how often do we do equity evaluations, right? You can't just have an evaluation that is never done, but, you know, how often do we return to an evaluation for equity? I think a lot of my thoughts, you know, the no, not yet too, like maybe the toolkit could point to how to do those equity evaluations, because I think we might struggle with how do we even do that? Like, how do we do an evaluation that isn't based in a white supremacist culture or a white supremacist practice of what an organization looks like? So yeah, just more questions. It is heartening to see that ongoing is the highest bar or the longest bar on this graph. Okay, back over to you, Melissa.
Thank you. So question 11 is my library developing internal policies for responding to hate speech, hate crimes, and hate propaganda at the library? And this question, I wondered if this question was really more directed at public libraries, because many universities may have policies that are meant to be used across all campus units, specifically about things like hate speech and hate crimes and things like that. If a library doesn't have its own internal policies, it might be a good idea to start with campus offices that handle these issues on campus and find out what those policies are and if they can be adapted or used in the library as internal policies as well. But whether the institution writes its own policies or adapts the campus policy to their library setting, everyone with a public facing job should know what that policy is. So the sort of I don't know question speaks to that maybe people who are dealing with the public every day don't actually know that the campus has a policy, and that definitely there may need to be some staff development and training on some of these issues. This seems like a great topic for an in-service training. And I know a lot of libraries are doing policy work on conduct. And that's one place where things like hate speech and those kinds of things can be addressed. And there are training resources on the OLA website that specifically look at conduct policies and how they can be and used for anti-racism work as well.
Yeah, and this next question is related to that. You know, I can only reflect on where I've worked for the past 11 or so years at Portland State. The Office of Global Diversity and Inclusion is the university's office where a lot of those things get reported. So with this question about microaggressions, emotional labor, and the reporting, like there's so much to unpack here. I think it is disheartening to see the no, not yet. I think one of the problems is that there are so many power structures in academic libraries. I think PSU is a really good example of that because we are on a tenure system. We also have non-tenure track librarians as well. And then we have like fixed term faculty who are librarians. And then we have staffs and then administration. So we're really stratified by the organization itself, by the university. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of one of the issues that we encounter. And speaking speaking just for myself as someone who has endured some microaggressions in the workplace, just based on my identity as a Jewish person, which people don't necessarily recognize. Like, do you want to even do the emotional labor to report it? Because that's, as someone who's, I mean, and I am so privileged as a white person, and I think that the tiny amount of my microaggressions I experience are like pale in comparison to what my colleagues of color may experience, even coming from me, right? Like, do people even want to take on the emotional labor to report something? Or do you just want to like move on with your day? So, and then emotional labor also has all sorts of implications in a university setting, especially when you're looking at promotion and tenure and evaluations. When you're working with students, which I think a lot of us do in higher ed, working with students with real basic human needs, like food insecurity, housing insecurity, things like that. Like that's emotional labor that we just do by nature of our jobs. So the no, not yet is disheartening, but it could be because of those institutional structures, but then also the power balance, right? Like you work so closely with these people. Do you feel comfortable reporting to your supervisor a microaggression or the emotional labor, you know? So there's that. Yeah, I guess I'll move on. I didn't really do anything about that data, but that's okay. And I apologize for the background noise. My pet rats are very active right now. Okay, number 13. Are we supporting BIPOC library employees and volunteers to participate in affinity groups? Again, no is very high. This could be because of our larger organizations in the university might have something. I don't know. They might not. In my at Portland State in the past, our union took that work on to have affinity groups. So there could be other institutions at your university or your college that are doing some of this work, which could account for the higher percentage of the no, not yet. The I don't know, again, is a communication issue, I think. And then yes, completed. You know, I hope that that answer is yes and not actually completed, right? Because affinity work and that kind of labor is ongoing. So those are my thoughts about that. Number 13. This one's also really disheartening. If if there's action being taken against some of against bias or racism, xenophobia, etc. However, the I don't know makes sense to me because a lot of these could be personnel actions that are confidential and that administration and management cannot share with employees. The other thing is that sometimes these things might get elevated to a different office in our larger institutions, but we can't really know. I think the ongoing might, I think especially in this question, it's at the moment it happens too, which can be very difficult, I think, in a workplace setting, especially over Zoom, right? Like, do you call someone out in chat? Do you private chat them? Do you like text them? Do you call them on the phone? Do you schedule it? Like, I think that's a logistical thing. So yeah, there's plenty more we could talk about that, but let's move on in the interest of time and conversation. Are we refraining from the colorblind narrative? This is also very heartening. I like to think that the low percentage of the no is good, and I'd like to smoosh all of the other categories together. I think that I don't know could be miscommunication or maybe more education personally and organizationally about what that colorblind narrative even is, right? Some of us, I think a lot of us who are even here today have a curiosity about anti-racism and anti-oppression work. So by nature of self-selecting into attending this webcast, I think that we are a little more conversant in some of these things. So I think the toolkit here can be a starting place for that concept of color blindness, and then and having those conversations. There's so many reading lists out there too that could be instructive for folks. professional development opportunities and things like that. So we could feasibly be doing, I don't know if anyone's been doing like anti-racism groups in their libraries or outside of their libraries. I belong to an anti-racism community of practice with 2 other white women at different institutions, or 3 other white women. And that's been very helpful for me. And that's an idea that I put out there. The other thing, just one more thing on this, is like when we're talking about in this question, patrons and workers of color, you know, depending on where you work, your patron base could be very different. So that's something to consider. And then like with the data, it's kind of hard to parse out, right? Like how many of us work in libraries that are so majority white, and how many BIPOC folks are in our libraries. The demographics, actually, I think Oregon does a little bit better than nationally. I was trying to think about demographics I know from ALA. Okay, let's move on. Thank you, Alma, our chauffeur. So then question 16 is also kind of interesting for us in academic libraries because unlike public libraries, you know, education in Oregon happens in English for the most part. There, at least in higher ed, aside from language and literature classes, there is also like IELP programs, so intensive English language programs, which aren't necessarily at PSU. They're not really PSU students. It's kind of conflated. I don't know if anyone, I think other schools have these programs. So so this is kind of like a question in terms of like, what is the role of the library versus what is the role of the institution and higher education in general? Okay, so this is the last question you'll hear from me about, and then I'll be passing it on. Yeah, so again, this like multilingualism or bilingualism, I think in academic libraries is a little bit different. It's been treated mostly, I would say, in technical services and cataloging, where we hire folks to do cataloging of other languages. At Portland State, we have someone who does Japanese. In the past, we had someone who was an Arabic speaker who helped to do some of that cataloging. So that's also something to consider there in terms of that. It might be interesting though to think about how we might reach out to students, especially who are multilingual, and maybe is there room for us to be doing promotion in languages other than English. Pass it over to you, Alma.
All right. So the next 3 questions all kind of go together. Number 18 is, does my library include persons with disabilities as participants in the planning, implementing, evaluating of library services, programs, and facilities? This one seems really obvious because how would you know if you're really accommodating people with disabilities if you don't include people with disabilities in the planning and implementation? But I know on some campuses, it may be hard to find available people to serve on committees or help with these things in the moment when it needs to be done. Most campuses do have a disability resources office, and they can often come in and make suggestions for services, programs, and facilities. And at least in our library, they also provide trainings for dealing with issues as they come up. One that's come up in our library is service animals and, you know, how to handle those situations. And so certainly keeping an open dialogue and a partnership with the Disability Resources Office may help in those situations where you don't have available people with disabilities to serve on committees or to help with the planning and implementation of programs. And then the next one is similar. It says, is my library removing architectural barriers in existing facilities to better serve patrons with disabilities? And I know certainly this is one where budgeting may make it difficult to make significant architectural changes, but certainly there are changes that can be done to make facilities more accessible. Again, definitely getting feedback from the Disability Resources Office and from people with disabilities and from facilities management is going to be essential to improving library spaces. I don't think it's bad for this particular question to be ongoing, since this is a continuous process. The more we learn about different kinds of disabilities, the more we find out ways to address issues in our spaces. Certainly any new construction projects would need to get feedback from people who actually have the disabilities in question. I'm not sure this is one that could ever really be done, because as we learn more about disabilities and especially neurodiversity, we realize that even spaces that are ADA compliant may not be as accessible as we think we are. In fact, ADA compliance may be a pretty low bar for some of these things. I actually just read this book that I will put a link to in the chat, but it's Supporting Neurodiverse College Student Success. And it talks a lot about spaces and about things that can be done in spaces, things that many of us wouldn't have necessarily seen as problematic, and that they may be completely ADA compliant, but they're not welcoming spaces for neurodiverse students or for people with learning disabilities or other things. So like I said, I'll put a link in the chat to the book, because I think it's got a lot of really great suggestions and examples of things that other libraries or college campuses have done to make spaces more accessible. And then the last question on this topic is my library working with people with disabilities, agencies, organizations, and vendors to integrate assistive technology into our facilities and services to meet the needs of people with a broad range of disabilities? So this also speaks a little bit more to the people with disabilities, broadly, not just say people in wheelchairs, but also people with all different kinds of sensory and learning disabilities, developmental disabilities, things like that. This is an area where I think a lot of education is being done now, and that may have to trickle down into the actual changes and policies and things like that. But it's heartening that so many libraries say this work is ongoing and that people are working to make these things more accessible. And again, like the book that I mentioned, I think has a lot of really, really good information in it. And one thing that came out in the book especially is that campus partnerships are really key to doing work in this area. So having partnerships with disability resources, with facilities, and then with maybe some unconventional organizations on campus, like campus wellness or recreation or other things like that, can also go a long way to make our programs and our spaces and everything more accessible. And then question 21 goes in a little bit of a different direction. It says, does my library support equal employment opportunities for gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and other LGBTQ+ librarians and library workers? So this one, when I first read the responses, I said, well, great, the yes number is so high, that's a really positive thing. And I thought, why are there any no's at all? Because the Oregon Equality Act actually prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. But there is a religious exemption. And I'm guessing that the one respondent who said no might have been in a private institution that's affiliated with a religion. And so that is an exemption in the Oregon Equality Act. What might be more important to talk about, though, and especially for those people who answered yes, completed to this question, is that it's one thing to follow the letter of the law and to not actively discriminate against people in these identity groups, but also about how equal employment opportunity is supported. So it's one thing to say you support equal employment opportunities, but there may be issues on hiring documents, such as questions about sex and gender, or there may be practices happening even inadvertently, like misgendering in interviews and things like that, that might be felt as discriminatory by applicants and may actually be discriminatory in those situations. So some of the simple things that can be done to make LGBTQ+ employees and applicants feel welcome are things like asking all employees to provide preferred pronouns, to provide ally training to library staff, and to work with the resource centers that your campus might have that support LGBTQ+ students, faculty, and staff, and to make sure that policies are inclusive. Certainly following the letter of the law is really the very lowest possible bar, and we all can probably do better to make everyone feel welcome and valued. I think that's the end of my part.
Okay, so I will be taking it for the next few questions. So starting with question 22, does my library support continuing professional development, present me with opportunities, and remove barriers that prevent my professional growth and success? So this was an area that I thought was very promising. Most respondents said that, yes, this is something that is occurring for them, with some saying that this is an ongoing process. However, a little over 11% said, no, not yet, or, I don't know, in terms of feeling supported in terms of their professional growth. I think for this question, I think it's important to know or to figure out, how much of your staff is always doing the frontline service, but rarely attends trainings or conferences. I think here, especially if you're a library administrator or supervisor or manager, are you aware of what your staff's professional goals are, and are you supporting them in terms of having like a plan with them? For the next question, the next two questions focus on discrimination. So I will be describing those a little bit and then I'll give my takeaways. So for question 23, I have heard or witnessed a situation where a patron or coworker of color faced racial discrimination at my library or another library in my state. So the majority of respondents said, no, this has not happened. And a little over 38% said, yes, they have witnessed or have heard of racial discrimination happening at their library or another library in Oregon. And then you had a little over 11% saying, I don't know, with a little over 6% saying ongoing. For question 24, I have heard or witnessed a situation where a patron or coworker faced gender discrimination at my library or another library in my state. So this one is, I found that the no and the yes were a lot closer to each other than in the previous question. So 43 respondents said, no, this has not happened, while 40 of them said yes. In the I don't know category, a little over 5% said, responded with that. And for ongoing, again, we have a little over 6%. So I think for these two questions, I think I would like to think that maybe the ongoing means sometimes, but it can also say that this is a persistent issue in those libraries. In terms of, I don't know, it could mean, again, maybe because of employee confidentiality reasons, we don't really know much about what happened in those scenarios or in those situations. However, I think it's really important to know for staff to be aware of how to recognize instances of discrimination, for them to be trained. The other thing too is whether or not there are existing policies and procedures for how to handle instances of discrimination among staff and patrons. And in terms of ongoing, if that is persistent, are those policies and procedures being enforced? So in other words, do you have any teeth with those policies? And in cases where a person has experienced discrimination, what kind of support is available for them in order to feel supported in those situations? So for question 25, is my library promoting training opportunities to give personnel the skills needed to provide effective services to diverse populations? So the majority of folks here responded with ongoing. So over 57% said, yeah, yes, this is something that we're working on. And over 29% said, yes, this is completed, with a few people saying, no, not yet, and I don't know. The one thing that I do want to point out is that our committee does have a list of training resources on our OLA website to assist people in terms of developing their diversity competence, that you can go ahead and take a look. But otherwise, it's really promising to see that this is an ongoing process for Oregon academic libraries. And finally, is my library advocating for supplemental support for library resources by urging local governments to provide adequate funding to hire bilingual bicultural staff? offer bilingual pay incentives, and implement ongoing library initiatives for diverse communities. So I think with this question, it's much more relevant to public libraries. However, I think what it does do is sort of point to, does your library have a diversity recruitment strategy? Do you have connections with BIPOC groups on your campus? How are you making sure that your job postings are being seen by librarians that belong to marginalized groups? So it is not surprising that most people said no or I don't know for this question. But that wraps up the survey results for our presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So much to take in. So now you can ask questions, definitely ask in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask your questions here. I'll go ahead and ask a question that came in the chat while you were presenting the data. And that is, as is not unusual with surveys, lots of questions are raised by these responses. Are there plans for further research to address the questions that have been raised by this survey?
I guess it depends on the future committee and whether or not they want to take on the extra labor of creating like a follow-up survey. For our current committee, a lot of us, of course, are volunteering and kind of doing this based off our own time. So, we didn't have time to actually do like focus groups or even like sit down and like interview people and ask them like, well, what did you mean by ongoing? So I guess that just depends on the future OLA EDI committee.
I'll chime in. I think it's also, the OLA, the ACRL Oregon board is soon or has started the conversation about what next year looks like and what our goals are. So just hearing that question, I think, Steve, you're the one who asked it, if I recall correctly. Thank you for asking that. It could be something that the board thinks about, and as an ACRL Oregon member, I think the board is really open to hearing what ACRL Oregon members want and need from us. So it could be something that the board considers looking into. So that's also something that. So I'm on the committee because of the ACRL Oregon relationship. So I'm like the representative, so to speak. So like we do have that connection of representation on the committee with the ACRL Oregon board. And I'll also put a plug out there. I think the committee is looking for OLA members to join. So if anyone wants to be doing this work, like sign up. Okay, that's long-winded, but the board could think about that. And if you have more thoughts, just email anyone on the board.
Yeah, I had a similar thought that the board could take on some of that potentially. So yeah. What other questions does this bring up for people? Don't be shy. I can summarize some of the other comments from the chat at the sort of very beginning of the presentation. When you're talking about hiring, there was some discussion about organizations using advocates in the hiring process at OSU, PCC, and University of Portland developing that program.
I can talk about what PSU has done. So PSU, I was the chair of the hiring committee several years ago, and what we've done is our former dean, Tom, was kind of liaised with human resources, and he let us know that we could we did a masked or a opaque review of candidates with stuff stripped out, and then identified people for phone interviews. And then Tom was able to share that list with our with a contact in the Office of Global Diversity and Inclusion, and they reviewed it with HR to see whether we had done an okay job with identifying folks from multiple identities or from different marginalized groups. And so because of that, that we got the like, yeah, y'all did a good job. So from there, then the identities were made open to us after that. So many of you all know that I'm quite a proponent for openness and transparency, but this is one, and there are problems with it, right? Like we all have our biases with this person wrote in academies and this, you know, like there are biases, but I think for that particular process, I appreciated the opacity. And I tried, at least as the chair of that committee, to be aware of my own biases when it came to writing style and things like that on people's cover letters and CVs. But we also had a contact train the committee before we went into our work from the Office of Global Diversity and Inclusion. So those are some of the practices that happened at PSU.
Some follow-ups in the chat. Looks like we did the same thing with our last search at PCC, Meredith says, and Carrie provided a link to the OSU Search Advocate Program.
Can I ask a question? Michelle talked about something about the PCC website. What was that?
Yes, so Michelle, oh, there she is.
Yeah, I can chime in. One of the things that the PCC library looked at, because we serve such a diverse population of students and community users, when the library went to redesign the website in the last 2 years, the digital services team and the access services team worked collaboratively to develop kind of very key information in multiple languages. And I linked it in the chat so that you all can see that. I think that might be one of the places where the four-year institutions and the community colleges might have some departure about serving people in multiple languages. I've heard that narrative come through in a couple of these presentations, and that's not necessarily the case, I think, for the community colleges, because we're dealing, we're interacting with students from so many different communities. And so this was really a commitment to create access to not everything on our websites, but some very key elements of library use and services.
Thanks, Michelle. A question from the chat: what are the next steps for the group, for the EDI Antiracism group in OLA? And thank you for the survey and evaluation.
Yeah, I guess depends on the next group. We have a year commitment. So you know, our year is up this July, August. As you all know, we also did work on a toolkit that we published and is also available on the OLA website. It's also hosted by the State Library of Oregon. Yeah, I feel like we did a lot. Oh yeah, and we also did revamp the OLA mentorship program. It was another thing that we did, which was sort of a way to connect BIPOC librarians with mentors and mentees to provide that support. So yeah, I feel like we did a lot.
We did a lot. Another question from the chat. The State Library of Oregon has been discussing the possibility of developing an open EDI workshop. Has this group been in communication with the State Library about this, or are you looking for alternative opportunities?
We did talk to the state library quite a bit actually, and specifically when we were working on the toolkit and about training and development and needs assessment of what kinds of workshops around these topics are needed by people. So we certainly have been talking to them quite a bit.
Oh, sorry to interrupt, Melissa. Yeah, I was going to say, I know that I went through like an outline of a proposed online training program and provided input on that. Just and I got that request came to the committee. So I know as individuals, yeah, we've seen that.
So then maybe as a refinement to the question, what will this group be doing? What do you have recommendations for the next group is the follow-up question in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, I think the next group has a lot of options. They might be interested in coming with a second edition of the toolkit. They could be interested in taking some of the questions or refining them and sending out another survey. Or, depending on what the group is interested in, they might take it a different direction. And I think that is totally okay.
Thank you. And then there was a question, can you talk a little bit more about the mentorship program?
Yeah, so the way that the mentorship program works is, so you can sign up via our OLA special committee portal. And basically the idea is that we want to connect professionals that have already been out on the field with someone who maybe might be new or might be considering applying for a librarian position. And so we just want to connect people there and make sure that they have someone who already kind of knows the reins, knows how to maybe deal with working in an institution they might not be familiar with. Yeah, and it's of course free and open to all library workers, so no charge for that.
Excellent, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any final questions for our presenters? There are, in case you have, or you're not reading the chat, there are many, many thanks and appreciations for the amazing work that your group did. And I'll certainly add mine to those.
I have a question actually to the audience. Can I do that?
You can definitely do that.
Okay, so and this is coming from the ACRL Oregon board. We've been having so many discussions about how to make participation in ACRL Oregon more equitable and accessible to people from marginalized communities or oppressed identities. And we've been trying really hard as to how to do that. But I personally, the board is only so big and our ACRL Oregon community is much bigger. If anyone has ideas about that, I personally would love to hear it. And maybe this is a larger conversation, but I think that's part of the work too, right? We need to have broader participation, understanding that there are time barriers, financial barriers, emotional barriers to participation in our awesome, what I think is our awesome organization. So I'd love to hear any thoughts about that.
So there's a question, can people join committees to help the ACRL board? I mean, ACRL is itself a committee of OLA. It's the academic, or a division of OLA. So it's the academic division of OLA. And then we have the board, and that's pretty much the only formal organization within ACRL Oregon. Currently, right? So I mean, that is one idea, right? Maybe the board could have more opportunities for more short-term, less formal membership participation, right? As something between just being a member and serving on the board, which is a bigger time commitment.
Yeah, I like that idea. We can also talk about that in our planning, and I'll put my email address in the chat if you want to send me a note, Marcia. Good idea. I mean, I don't know if you've just signed yourself up for something.
Right. Well, if you have final questions, you can put them in the chat. But for now, I'm going to just really thank Alma and Melissa and Emily for sharing your time with us and sharing the results of your survey. And again, just for the incredible amount of work that your group did. Bravo.
Thanks for hosting, Rachel.
Yes, and participants, expect to see the link to the recording in your email in the coming days, and a link to the evaluation form. If you can fill that out, that would be very helpful to us. And thank you all for spending some time with us this morning.
It was great.
And oh, I will stop recording.